Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcella Paris, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I'd like to welcome you all to the Great Falls Forum. The forum is a monthly speaker series sponsored by the Bates College, Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library, and features leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, the arts. This year marks the 25th season of the Great Falls Forum. So we thank you for your support in ensuring the program's continued success, even through a couple virtual years. So welcome back. Today's program is also streaming live via Zoom and Facebook, and a recording will be available on the library's YouTube page within a few days. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. And please mark your calendars for our next Great Falls Forum that will be on December 8th. And it'll be a talk entitled Accelerant Detection Canines in Fire Investigation. More information will be available soon on the library's website. At the conclusion of today's program, there will be opportunity for audience questions. Those in the room are welcome to raise your hands and we'll bring around a microphone to you. And those joining us virtually can enter their questions using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen at Zoom and comment on Facebook, and we'll read those out loud to our panelists. And now I'd like to turn the program over to today's panel moderator, Leslie Hill, Professor Emerita of Politics at Bates College. Please join me in welcoming Leslie and all of our panelists.
Welcome, everyone. I want to thank the panelists for joining the conversation today. I'm really excited about hearing them and talking with them. Also want to just give a little shout out to Adila Muhammad, who I hear suggested this topic. And so we have done some preparation and we're looking forward to jumping in. I also think it's interesting that this panel occurs in coincidence with the election of 3 women of African descent to the Maine state legislature. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but it's interesting to think about the ways in which the present can evoke our interest in finding out more about the past. First, I'd like to say again, welcome to the panel and ask each of you to briefly identify yourself, and then I'll say a little bit more about the structure of today's program.
Go first. Hi, I'm Rachel Ferrante. I'm the Executive Director of Museum LA. I started in the job about 15 months ago. I'm a Bates College grad and have spent the last decade working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Moved back to Maine last summer with my family and have been running the museum since then. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more about what the museum's trying to do in a little bit.
Hi, I'm Candace Keynes, and I am currently working as a researcher at Bowdoin College, looking at the institution's history. Which is related to this topic today. And before that, I spent many years as the curator of Maine Memory Network at the Maine Historical Society and as a newspaper reporter and editor, including at the Lewiston Sun Journal.
My name is Bob Green. I am 8th generation to be born in Cumberland County. My family goes back to at least 1750 in Cumberland County, Maine. I'm a journalist by trade, retired a few years back. And it was my oldest son asked me if we had any relatives. It started me on the genealogical search. And it's through that I began looking at Blacks in Maine, and which brings us to today. Thank you.
Thank you. Our goal here today is to hear some overlooked stories in order to learn more and to think more broadly about African Americans in Maine. A second goal is to share some thoughts about one intriguing question. What is the significance of overlookedness? I want to point out to those of you who may have seen Bob Green's library talk in January, this is not Bob Green 101, but we are going to build on some of the things we learned from Bob and hopefully extend some parts of that conversation. We'll proceed first by my posing a question to each of the panelists. And so give them a chance to say more about how they got into this topic, and then to offer an overlooked story. And perhaps we'll have a chance to hear more stories as the conversation goes on. So would each of you share, first of all, tell us briefly how you came to this topic of African Americans or Black folks in Maine, and then share one overlooked story that you think illustrates the invisibility of African Americans here.
So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the museum is in a mill, and its story is rooted in the mill story, in telling the story of the workers of the textile, the shoe, and the brick making industries. And many people here have a direct connection to those stories. I am not from here, as I mentioned, and I don't have a direct connection to those stories. That's not directly impactful to me, but I am impacted by their stories, and I was interested in those stories more broadly. So when I first came to the museum, I was really interested to understand, first and foremost, what the history of the museum, what its mission was to try and talk about. And it was pretty clearly defined as being from 1850 to the present. And so that struck me in a couple of ways. First of all, it didn't feel to me like you can just pick a date in history that you start talking about history. So we're trying to do a little bit better about talking about what happened before the mills existed here, and that the mills were not created on pristine land, and what happened with the Native Americans, and tell the Wabanaki story, for example, a little better. But when we say to the present, the mills closed 20 or 30 years ago. And so I think what the museum is trying to do a little bit better with is talk about the more recent stories as well in town. If we're talking about workers and laborers, there are plenty of workers and laborer stories to be told over the last 20 and 30 years. To your question, one specific story that really struck me as I walk through sort of our more permanent exhibition that we have upstairs at the moment, was a really simple one that we're going to try to do better, and is really complex. But the Bates Mill was a huge driver of used a lot of cotton to create all of the products. And so in our upstairs gallery, we display some of that cotton and talk about how the cotton was literally transported from the South to here. We haven't historically talked about who picked that cotton and how much of a driver Benjamin Bates and the Bates Mills were of the slave trade. And so that's one example for me of not really telling the whole story that I think we can do better. These, Bates patterns and Bates products are incredibly important to lots of people, and they're an important part of the industrial history of the area. But telling the whole story really means starting with that raw material, where it came from, and telling the labor story as it first began.
I got interested in Black history in Maine probably before I started working at the Maine Historical Society in 2003. But as the historian and curator for Maine Memory Network, I worked with historical organizations and libraries and museums all over the state. And I personally mined the Maine Historical Society's collections for stories that included Black history and Bob Green's expertise, and but also encouraged other historical societies to do the same. But the story that I'm going to tell you today is one that I came upon because I was curating the Maine Historical Society's Civil War exhibit when the state was doing the bicentennial or the sesquicentennial of the Civil War in 2013 and encouraging organizations all over the state to do exhibits and other things at the same time. And I wanted to tell a story that included Blacks. However, Blacks were not allowed to join the Army when the war started, and not really until 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation. And then it was kind of hard to trace where Black people from Maine might have gone, although I found a few. And so I decided instead to focus on what happened immediately after the Civil War with formerly enslaved people who came to Maine. And there were a few stories around about a few of those people, including in Maine's Visible Black History, the book that came out in, I forget what year, 2007, 6, 8, I don't know. Anyway, but I started looking at census information about people who the census identified as Black or mulatto. That's another whole story that we could talk about for days, but the census identified as Black or mulatto who were born before 1863 in a slave owning state. So I came up with about who lived in Maine by 1870. So the census is only every 10 years, which makes it a little challenging to trace people. But anyway, I came up with a database of about 300 or 400 people who fit that category and just began doing research. And so I had lots of names and tried to figure out who the people were and where they came from and why and how they got here, and began focusing especially, and the story I'm going to tell you now is about people who were brought through the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau. Many people came with soldiers or other people they met in the South during the Civil War and came to Maine. But I'm going to talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. The only director of the Freedmen's Bureau in its short life, in the short life of Reconstruction after the war, was Oliver Otis Howard, who was from Leeds, Maine. And he personally brought some formerly enslaved people before 1863 to Maine. But I discovered that Alonzo Garcelon, who was the Maine's Surgeon General during the war and who founded the Lewiston paper and was a doctor and did all sorts of things. I think because of his contacts with Howard, he brought a bunch of people to the Lewiston area. And so I was very curious how that happened, and I began researching Freedmen's Bureau records and all sorts of things. And then I discovered in one of my favorite sources, which is old newspapers, and Google newspapers, when they first started doing it, they have long since abandoned the project, but it's still online, but did the Lewiston Journal. And it's a fabulous resource, I will say. But anyway, I found this little article, and this is how much print there is. And in the paper, it was about this big. It was in a column called Of Local Interest, and I'll just read it to you. And said, 40 years ago Friday, the first colored people came to Lewiston from the South, and in observance of the date, a pleasant evening was spent together. The moving spirit in the arrangements being Robert Creart. William Davis and Benjamin Grice and their families were among the first to come, Dr. Alonzo Garcelon being instrumental in inducing them to come to Lewiston. They were fine folk, William Davis and Ben Grice, honest, industrious, frugal, and of good purpose. Benjamin Grice died some years ago, rich in the faith. William Davis is still working on, a faithful man in every relation. It was a good day when they came to Lewiston. So this little article gave me names, most of which I already had, but also gave me the date that this group of formerly enslaved people came to Lewiston. So I'm going to just tell you one more thing about one of them and move on. But Ben Grice, who's mentioned in the article, who had already died, was featured in several articles in the Lewiston Journal. And the first one that I found was because he was ill and they were asking for people to provide support for him. And so the article said, this was on May 16th, 1883. It called Ben Grice one of the best known faces about town, and then described him as the faithful colored janitor of the Pine Street Congregational Church, and by unanimous consent, the politest man in Lewiston. So for me, that captured so much about, well, let me step back 1 second and say, teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal. So for the most part, the people who came to Lewiston, who I'm looking at, were illiterate. It doesn't mean they couldn't read or write at all, but they were basically illiterate. They had all endured slavery. So calling somebody the politest man in Lewiston was kind of an indication to me that Ben Grice had been enslaved and knew how he should act around white people. Because if he didn't, I imagine he was afraid he would endure what he had endured while he was enslaved. But the other part about it is that almost none of the stories that I've uncovered are in the people's own words, even if they're quoted in the newspaper. And there are a number of newspaper articles and feature stories. So trying to reconstruct lives of people who didn't leave written records and couldn't tell their own stories is really challenging. But I could go on for hours about the Lewiston group, but I made a little, I know you can't see this, but you sort of get the idea. I made this little diagram at one point of the connections among the formerly enslaved people who came at about the same time, many through the auspices of Garcelon, but some in other ways. And it's just amazing. It was a small community, and the relationships that happened because they were the only Black people in Lewiston at the time. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Bob.
It is not a new thing that Blacks have arrived in Maine, despite no one noticing. The first recorded Black person that we know by name to step on these shores was Matthew da Costa. He was here in 1608, 12 years before the Pilgrims arrived. Da Costa was an interpreter for the French explorers that included Samuel de Champlain. And he was believed to be fluent in Dutch, English, French, Portuguese, Micmac, and Pidgin Basque. And he's known to have been sought by both the English and the Dutch to help in their contacts with the peoples here, the native peoples here in this land. A friend of mine in Portland, Vanna Carmona, is researching Black folks in Maine before 1800. If you think that we're newcomers, Vanna has already found by name almost 2,000 Black folks in the state of Maine before 1800. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, that includes my 6-time great-grandfather, who was born in 1750 in the New Gloucester area, not that far from here. So we're not newcomers. It's interesting when you read the Portland newspapers, and they talk about very few Blacks in Portland in 1800. Yet when you go back and check by household, you find that there are quite a few. And I'm talking about, when I say quite a few, I'm talking about at least 100, 150 in 1800 in Portland. And they didn't come just as servants or slaves or seamen. There have been others here. In fact, Wilson Crawford owned a hotel in Eastport sometime around 1860. He had at least 11 people working for him in the hotel. 4 of those employed by Wilson were listed as Black, and 7 others were called mulattoes. And all of those 11 were listed as servants. There were 5 whites in the hotel at the time. There are no records to tell us exactly what hotel Crawford owned. There were 2 major, several hotels in the city at the time. And unfortunately, on October 22, 1864, downtown Eastport was burned completely. You don't find him in the 1870 census. I have no clue. He was a native, however, of, he was from Nova Scotia when he came to Maine. He was a native of Louisiana. And he married his wife who was in Nova Scotia. So maybe that's where they went back to Canada. And there have been others all around the state. And it's quite interesting in doing the research to find that we're talking about more than just menial labor.
That's a lot to get us started. Thank you. One of the things that we thought might be helpful is to begin to think about some specifics in those stories. Rachel, I'd like to ask you about museums. Museums are places where that feature creations, but also seem to be places that are themselves creating and innovating. Is the LA Museum expanding the story of its evolving self-understanding of itself as a museum, as a storyteller? How would you think about that?
Yes. So I think the answer is unequivocally yes, as I think all museums sort of have to right now. So I think museums as a field are sort of reckoning with being the keepers of history and historically having been keepers of very specific histories, excluding Black history, female history, Native American history. I mean, pretty much anybody that wasn't white, rich, Western male, more or less. Like at some level, every museum is reckoning with their portion of that, I think. What's interesting to me about Museum LA is that it is at its core a museum that was started by community members in a community to tell the story of work and innovation and learning. And so those are, for me, the key words that we're trying to figure out how to tell a broader, more inclusive, more accessible version of learning and innovation and labor. So that means not just telling the textile and shoe and brick making stories, though that's important, and actually really incredible stories of innovation and labor in those stories, but connecting that also to the more recent history of how is the Lewis, if we're a community museum, we need to be about all of the communities that are here, and how is this place remaking itself now that the mills have closed, and telling some of those stories as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Bob, you've been traveling around Maine for years, collecting lots of stories, lots of ways that stories of communities have been recorded. How far back you did mention that the Cossack arrived in 1608, but earlier today you talked about waves of Black folks who have come to Maine. I found it interesting as somebody who arrived in Maine from away, to be able to think more broadly about how African Americans got here and the ways in which they arrived, and of course what they did when they got here. So how would you describe those waves? How would you describe the earlier and more recent arrivals?
There are several things that we don't think about. That if once you get this in your mind, you understand why things have happened. One, it's easy to travel now with interstates and automobiles, et cetera. But the period we're talking about, early period of this country, you could only travel 3 ways: by boat, by horse, or by foot. That's one reason when you start looking at Maine, places like Lewiston, which are quite a ways inland, so to speak, and the Androscoggin River here is actually in falls during this period, the reason why they actually built here. The only way they're late in people coming because you had to walk or take a horse. Maine coastline, the longest, by the way, in the country. Our coastline is longer than California's if you could stretch it out. That it was great to travel into. And so that you find people from Portland could easily get to Boston or to New York by boat where they couldn't get to Lewiston. I say all of this to tell you the waves of how people came. The first wave of Blacks that came into Maine came from via the sea to work, like everybody else came to Maine, to find jobs or to find places to live. So you find along the seacoast, from Eastport, which I mentioned earlier, down to Kittery, you find waves of Blacks had come in. And until the Irish arrived after 1850, Blacks dominated the ports as far as longmen are concerned, people walking on the ships. That was the first wave. Then there were others that came. For example, as Candace mentioned, a group came after the Civil War, came back with returning Maine men. Then you look at World War II, when we had the shipyards, and another wave of Blacks arrived. Now, of course, lately we've had a wave of Africans arrive. So over the period of time, there've been waves and waves and waves of Black folk coming into the state, invisibly, of course.
Thank you. Candace, you talked a little bit about unearthing stories and using, raising a question about a period that's very visible to us, but using it to probe and to unearth pieces of the overlooked, the invisible history of African Americans. If people wanted to explore and to begin to unearth stories in their own communities, where would you suggest that they look?
Whoa, First of all, talk to longtime residents of the community about what they know or what they've heard. And not everything they've heard, of course, is probably accurate. But there are so many sources that we don't think about. We were talking earlier about town histories, and many towns of various sizes have town histories that were usually written at the end of the 19th century and weren't particularly inclusive. But town histories can lead you to places to look, to find Indigenous and Black residents of the town, even if they're not featuring Black people in the histories, they still show up. The best source to get started, I think, is the US Census. And because it's digitized, and if you go to a library, it's free to use Ancestry, and you don't have to look up a particular name. So if you don't know anybody's name who might have been in your community, the census isn't always accurate, but census takers back in the old days used to go down one street, then across this way, and then down this way and around the block. So you can see neighborhoods, you can see who lived near each other, but also, the census is listed, if you haven't used it, it's listed by household. And so you can see all the people who lived in that household and their relationships to each other, many years, the census tells you that. It also, almost every year, tells you people's race. And this especially isn't particularly accurate, but it's a clue. So it'll say W for white, B for Black, M for mulatto, I for Indian, although those change a little bit different years. But the reason you don't need to know a name is you can, if you go to Ancestry or probably some other services, you can ask to look, for instance, at the 1860 census, and you can pick the state and you can pick the town you're interested in. And then you can just look through, I've done this for Lewiston and Auburn, and which have many pages to the census. So, you can just take your finger and go down the list and see if you see Black people or mulattoes or whatever. But also for some years of the census, the 1860s, 70s, I'm not sure about the 80s, I can't remember, but at the bottom of the page, the census taker was supposed to summarize the number of white males, Black males, white females, Black females, and immigrants. So you can look, quickly through a town and sort of see what the census takers thought the makeup of the town was. And it's a really good way, if you don't know names of people, to get started and find out who might have been in a community. Right. Local historical societies are really great resources also. And, you can't walk in and say, tell me what you have about Black history in whatever the town is, because they might not know that, but there are other ways, you can start trying to figure out who might have been there, who doesn't show up in the kinds of things, because most historical societies have things because people leave them to them. And so, I looked at the Androscoggin Historical Society for the formerly enslaved people I've been researching for all these years, and they didn't really have anything, which makes sense given, what kinds of things people leave. But you'll find clues, and the more you start talking to people and talking about, well, what kinds of businesses were here, who was doing what, were there certain kinds of organizations, like, Lewiston ended up even having a mutual aid society that was created by this group of people who came after the Civil War. So, you can find things like that, and just kind of, it's tedious, you just go here and here and here until you find stuff. But newspapers are the greatest resource. And like I mentioned before, Google newspapers isn't supported anymore, but through the library's website, you can find a link to the journal, Lewiston Evening Journal, on Google newspapers. But also, if you look at the Maine State Archives or the Maine State Library's website, you'll find a whole list. And I don't know if the Lewiston website links to that or not, but there's a digitization project for Maine newspapers, and they've done a lot of smaller newspapers in a lot of communities, and they're searchable. And the other source is the Library of Congress, which is has sponsored the digitization project that the Maine State Library and museum have been doing for years.
Thank you.
And you'll find a lot of great stuff there.
Thank you, Candace. As you all were talking, it occurred to me that I was reminded myself, some years ago, I lived in Portland, and I lived on the East End. And it was interesting to me. I think it was in listening to your January talk, Bob, that I learned that there were blocks on which multiple families lived in Portland on the East End. When I lived there from 2000 to 2014, they were invisible. And I had no idea that there were Black folks, African Americans, people of African descent, that had lived on the East End at all. There just wasn't any indication there. So, it occurs to me that people and their legacies don't just disappear. Invisibility doesn't not happen naturally. If we are to fill in the picture, then we need to know how it happened, how that invisibility came to be. And that's kind of what I'm asking you to think about, to explore the idea of overlookedness. We're going to do that for a few minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. Bob, you're ready. Let's go.
Yes. I grew up on Montjoy Hill, the east end of Portland. I grew up in my grandmother's house. The family purchased that house in 1897. And you're right. At least half of the block were people with Black folks. Across the street was a family that is kind of well known even today. When I was a freshman in high school at Portland High, a senior at the school lived across the street from me. And her daughter is Susan Rice. So Lois Dixon was the mama and my classmate. So we grew up together, but there were a lot of others on that block. One of them on the block that I knew all of my life, Cecil Gaskell, I'm sorry, I got his name wrong, Cecil Hines, was captain of the Portland High School football team in 1934. I didn't know that until I was doing research. It's interesting because, like I said, I grew up my life and that's the way things were. But for some reason, people my color are invisible. And that's hard to understand. But probably came up most, though, during the Underground Railroad, when they moved people through Maine, through Waldoboro, building the Avery family, building stone walls. And no one counted the people, noticing, for example, that there were 6 people building the wall today, and yesterday there were 8, and the day before there were only 4. So I guess in some ways invisibility is a good thing.
Sure. Okay. You know, it occurs to me that, like I said, the coincidence of this panel with the election of Jill Dewson, the first African-American woman to sit in the Maine State Senate in January, I suppose. The election of 2 Somali American women, Dalak, who was the nation's first Somali American mayor, has been elected to the Maine State House, and Mana Abdi, also Somali American from Lewiston, elected to the House. So we have some firsts right here in our present. And what I'm wondering is about what you all think and what the panelists think about using the present, using our curiosity about the present to excavate the past. What kind of questions can we ask? How can we go back? If I think about, for example, Jill Dewson, well, this is not her first public office holding. She goes back a ways. And then you kind of step back and ask, well, who preceded Jill? She was a mayor in Portland, but then you've got other Black folks who have served as mayors in Maine. How can we kind of use our thinking about the present to step back and excavate some of those stories? I invite panelists and audience members to just kind of weigh in and or ask your own questions. Yes, you have a question.
And I'm going to pass
She's
you the
got a mic.
microphone. So our folks online can hear you also.
I'm curious about something. Most of the earlier waves of immigrants came to a community where the mills provided pretty easy employment and integration into the community through sort of a melting pot in those mills. How is the experience different for, say, the more recent waves like the Somalis, where those mills aren't available for that sort of easy entry into the economy here and the community? Is that changing their experience and what they're able to do coming to this community now compared to the past?
No conceivable way I could probably say what it is like to come here as a first generation immigrant or as a Somali. What I can say is that while the mills certainly provided work opportunities, they weren't great work opportunities. It was hard manual labor and they struggled a lot. And there was quite a bit of separating even among what we would now just classify as white people, right? There was a whole thing about the Irish having come here to build the canals, which the mills needed for power, and more French Canadians being here to really work in the mills. And there are lots of newspaper articles and others about French Canadians and Irish not getting along and really being separated and having lots of issues there. I think there are a lot of additional, more modern time struggles that make it such that I don't think I'm in a position personally to speak about what it is like to come here. What I can provide as a museum director is a space to invite people in who have lived those experiences and reflect that back to the community. So one way we do that is through taking oral histories, which we've done. We've taken about 300 mill, shoe, and brick maker stories. I'm working with Professor Medford at Bates College to take 10 Black oral histories as a start, focusing primarily on people, first generation immigrants, but not exclusively, as a way for hopefully people that have lived that different experience to be able to share their stories. And then we as a museum can reflect that back in the person's own words.
I know from the formerly enslaved people I've researched who came to Lewiston, Auburn, and to lots of other places in Maine, none of them worked at the mill. And I think that the mill did not hire Blacks. Most of them were, some of them had small businesses eventually, but many of them were in, farming or service professions. And that was true around the state. And many of the people I've researched didn't stay in Maine. A lot of the people who came right after the Civil War didn't stay. And it's perhaps what you're talking about, sort of not an easy way to fit in, but also because there were relatively small numbers in each location that people were sent to after the Civil War, and they were sent there because somebody requested, help on the farm or whatever. So there wasn't a community, and I think you need some kind of community, whether it's the mill or something else.
I think I might have to disagree with my panelists here. And there were Blacks working in the mills, whether you'd be talking about textiles or shoes or whatever. Not many, but there were some. One of this goes back to life. You have a place to live. And in your block, there's an apartment or a house comes up available. And you know that a relative of yours is looking for something. So you tell them about it. The same thing is true about jobs.
Mhm.
And so that's a reason that that you find a lot of cousins and other relatives in the same job or in the same neighborhood. But there have been some that I have found invariably around. The other thing is, you have to understand, a lot of the Somalians that are here now, this is not their first stop in the United States. A lot of them, when they came, were settled in the Atlanta, Georgia area.
Mhm.
And what I was told was that the sounds at night reminded them too much of the problems that they had left behind. And then they heard about Maine and they felt safe. And there were jobs that even they created. So that's the reason they're here. And I think Lewiston is very happy to have them because they've kind of revitalized the area.
We have a question from our online audience.
So Charles writes, I am the descendant of a free Black named Daniel. Daniel Over. My fourth great grandfather who settled in St. George in about 1810. His granddaughter, my great-great-grandmother, was bound to a family at age 3 in 1850 on Great Cranberry Isle after the death of her mother. So the question is there a way to learn more about organizations who may have been responsible for handling orphan children?
I have no clue.
Yes, and I don't know what they are, but they definitely exist.
Yes, we have a question in the audience.
You mentioned that the Irish and French sometimes didn't get along. An incident happened to me about 50 years ago. I had someone that worked with me that was not French, and we had a French supervisor, and he retired. And we had an Irish gentleman that worked in the same company, but promoted to supervisor. That was back in 1970. Well, immediately on his first day on his new job, put me in a lot of pressure to do more work, do the dirty work. I was unaware that the French and Irish didn't get along. I didn't know that back 50 years ago. But it got so bad that I left that employment after about a few months. And so I'm not sure if it's still visible today, but 50 years ago, it happened to me. So you're correct. They probably didn't get along, which I learned the hard way. Thank you.
As I think about your response, Candace, to the question about unearthing stories, I wonder if all of you could speak to the ways in which African Americans communicated themselves among themselves. You know, some of the earlier waves of settlers had not learned to read. Maybe some did when they got here. They were not writers. So, but they have stories. Where are their stories? Are there places where we can unearth the ways in which they communicated together? They might have been, some of that communication might have been more institutionally based, say in a church or a congregation, or, you know, certainly in family stories and family letters and photographs. How is it that might be a source of unearthing? Bob, you've got a
Yes, Candace made mention of it earlier. The best source is old newspapers. They tell what happened about the people, everyday things.
And who was visiting whom?
Yes, everything. So, and it makes it very interesting to learn these things. There are a lot of ways to find out the truth. And they all are in newspapers, even the bad truth. By the way, when I was young and growing up in Portland, in a very red state, there were 5 cities in the state that were Democratic: Lewiston, Auburn, Saco, Biddeford, and Waterville. And all 5 had mills and were peopled by French Canadians. I left Portland. I went off to, ended up at the University of Kansas, another red state. And I was quite shocked when I heard that Maine had elected a Democrat as governor.
got another online question.
Could I answer,
Oh, yeah.
go back to the orphan question for a minute? I think the best place to start looking is churches, because they often had networks who dealt with orphans, or groups who dealt with orphans, and it might be at least a place to get started and see what other organizations might have been around. I don't think the state, I don't know when the state had a formal process, started a formal process of dealing with orphans, but the person could also check with state archives.
Thank you. Question.
We have another question from Zoom. In order to not perpetuate the narrative that erases Black people from the past and current in Maine, what do we say in response to comments such as Maine is the whitest state in the nation?
That is a very, I think the response is statements like that do not allow for unearthing the multiple stories that exist. And it provides just one viewpoint whereby people believe they understand an entire state with one statement. And we all know that not only are there multiple stories told here, varying by race just in Lewiston, the Lewiston story is very different than the Portland story or an Aroostook County story or a Bangor story. And so I think that's one version of the answer. And I think the other version of that is I take it as a what can I do personally to at least make it feel like in my life and in what I do every day, I'm trying to reverse that narrative. And so that's why I talk about some of the ways we're doing that through exhibitions and programming and the stories we're trying to tell. At least hopefully that's not true in my part of the world in the museum in the next 5 or 10 years.
I happen to disagree, but I'm gonna leave it there.
Well, I agree that just dismissing the issue by saying Maine is the whitest state isn't very helpful for anything. But I think the more we look at the actual history and the more people start unearthing stories, like a lot of the work Bob has done and the people he was talking about who, 2,000 Black people in the state, that whitest state in the union is a statistic that comes from somebody reporting something about race somewhere, and people's backgrounds don't always match what the statistic says, and nor do the lived experiences. So I think we should ignore that and get busy in trying to be more inclusive in the research we do and the things we talk about and bring forward in whatever we're doing.
Thank you. If I may, I'd just like to add something about narratives, received narratives. I think when we hear something like that, particularly something pithy and short and compact that seems to capture the whole story, that we ask the question, where does it come from? And just in the way, yes, you can look at Maine's population figures and see a predominance of people who identify as white here. But just like you would never tell the story of your own families with only numbers, you tell it with stories. And to ask, what are the stories that tell us something about the history of Maine? In the very first place, one cannot dismiss who occupied this land for thousands of years. Indigenous Americans. So we at least start there. And then we ask, how did it happen? Who are the populations who came here? What are their stories? What were their lives like? What were their experiences like? Those are the ways in which we would approach the stories of our own families and our own communities. So it's say the numbers are a very small part of the story, a small part of the history. We need to unearth the stories. And I thank all of the panelists for sharing their thinking about ways to do that, their approaches to doing that, and some of those stories. Thank you very much.